The ballroom at the Harrington Plaza smelled like money and roses and something else. Something sharper underneath, like ambition that had curdled into cruelty. Lena Whitmore stood at the entrance to the grand hall and let herself take it all in, just for a moment. Crystal chandeliers dripping light onto ivory tablecloths. Centerpieces tall enough to block the faces of the people sitting across from each other, which, she suspected, was entirely the point. Her ex-husband had always preferred the kind of conversations where no one had to look directly at anyone else. She had been married to Douglas Whitmore for 9 years. She had believed, with the particular stubbornness of someone who had built their entire adult life around a single decision, that she had made the right choice. She had been wrong. But that wasn't the story Douglas wanted to tell tonight. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks ago. Cream card stock, embossed lettering, the kind of thing that cost more per envelope than Lena used to spend on groceries for a week. Mr. Douglas Whitmore and Ms. Celeste. She hadn't even been able to finish reading the name before setting it down on her kitchen counter and walking to the window to stare out at nothing. He had invited her to his wedding to the woman he had started seeing while Lena was still his wife, while she was working double shifts at the hospital to keep their health insurance from lapsing, while she was eating lunch at her desk to save the hour of overtime, while she was telling herself every single night that the distance between them was temporary, that marriages went through dry seasons, that she just needed to be patient. She had been patient for 6 years too long. The divorce had been quiet, the way certain kinds of devastation are quiet, not a storm, a slow leak. Douglas had sat across from her at their own dining room table, the one they had picked out together at a furniture store in Burlington, arguing pleasantly over whether to get the oak or the walnut finish, and told her that he felt invisible in the marriage, that Lena made him feel small, that he had met someone who actually saw him. Lena had not screamed. She had not thrown anything. She had sat very still and looked at her hands and thought about all the things she had done to make their life possible. The night shifts, the missed holidays, the slow erosion of her own desires until she couldn't have told you what she wanted anymore, only what she owed. "Who is she?" Lena had asked. "You don't know her," Douglas said. That was a lie. Celeste Arquette had been at their house twice. She was the marketing director at Douglas's firm, a woman who wore silk blouses to casual Fridays and laughed a particular kind of laugh, the kind designed to make the men in the room feel clever. Lena had shaken her hand. She had offered her a glass of wine. She had thought, she seems nice. The divorce settlement was swift because Lena let it be. She was too tired to fight. She took what was fair and signed what needed signing and moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Midtown with her cat, a bad radiator, and the very specific grief of a woman who had not lost love, so much as she had lost the version of herself she had been trying to protect. For 14 months after the divorce, Lena Whitmore existed rather than lived. She worked, she slept sometimes. She called her sister on Sundays. She bought a second-hand piano and spent evenings relearning Debussy, because her fingers remembered what her mind had forgotten, and there was comfort in that. In the idea that some things stayed with you, even when everything else left. And then she met Theodore Vance. She had not been looking. She was clear on that point even now. She had gone to a gallery opening because her colleague had begged her to come, and then gotten sick at the last minute. And Lena had already put on her good coat and couldn't face going back to the apartment. She had been standing in front of a painting she didn't understand, holding a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, when a man stopped beside her and said, "It's a shipwreck, I think. The painter lost her brother at sea. If you know that, the whole thing shifts." Lena had looked at him. He was tall, unhurried, with the kind of face that had clearly been handsome once and was now something better. Interesting. Lived in. He was looking at the painting, not at her, which she appreciated. "Do you know a lot about her?" Lena asked. "Just that one thing," he said. "I looked it up on the way in because I was going to be standing here alone and I wanted to have something to say." She had laughed. A real one, the kind that surprised her. Theodore Vance had made his money in infrastructure. The unglamorous, essential kind, fiber networks and water treatment facilities, and the logistics that kept cities running. He was not the sort of person who mentioned this at parties. He mentioned it to Lena 3 weeks into knowing her, almost as an apology, because a journalist had published a piece ranking him among the top 50 wealthiest individuals in the state, and he wanted her to hear it from him first. "Does it change anything?" he had asked. Lena had thought about it honestly. "It changes that I understand why you never seem worried," she said, "which is actually something I've been envying." He smiled at that. He had a good smile. Slow, like it had to travel a long way before it arrived. They had been together for almost 8 months when Douglas's invitation arrived. Lena had shown Theodore the card without saying anything. He read it twice. "He wants you there," Theodore said. "He wants me to watch," she said. "There's a difference." She knew Douglas well enough to understand the architecture of this invitation. He would have imagined the moment for weeks before sending it. Lena arriving alone, perhaps visibly strained, wearing something that almost worked but didn't quite. She would sit at a table in the back and watch him marry Celeste, and the story he would tell himself. The story he had probably already been telling would be confirmed, that he had escaped, that he had upgraded, that Lena, for all her intelligence and her long hours and her careful competence, had been the thing holding him back rather than the thing holding him up. "Are you going to go?" Theodore asked. Lena was quiet for a long time. The radiator clicked. Her cat crossed the floor with the particular indifference of a creature who has never once felt the need to justify herself. "Yes," she said. Theodore had looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read. Not surprise, something more like recognition. "Okay," he said. "Then we're going." The first person to see her was Douglas's mother, Harriet. No, that name was taken. His mother, Rosamond, who had never disguised her disappointment that her son had married a nurse instead of someone from a family she recognized. Rosamond Whitmore stood near the entrance greeting guests, and Lena watched the woman's expression move through several phases in rapid succession. Confusion, recalibration, something close to alarm, because Lena did not look the way Rosamond had expected. Lena wore a gown the color of midnight water, deep blue-green, draped silk, the kind of dress that required a certain stillness to wear well. She was still. Theodore was beside her in a charcoal suit, one hand resting at the small of her back, with the casual confidence of a man who was accustomed to occupying rooms. Behind them, just visible through the open doors of the lobby, the town car waited at the curb. They had arrived together. They had arrived like people who had somewhere better to be and were choosing to be here instead. "Lena," Rosamond said. "Rosamond," Lena replied. "You look well." She did not introduce Theodore immediately. She let the moment sit. Rosamond's eyes moved to Theodore with the involuntary assessment of someone doing arithmetic she hadn't expected to need. "And this is Theodore Vance," he said, extending his hand. Easy, unhurried. His name did the rest of the work. Rosamond shook his hand, and Lena watched understanding cross the older woman's face like weather moving across a field. Rosamond Whitmore was not a stupid woman. She would know the name. She would know what the name meant. And she would spend the rest of the evening trying to work out how Lena, the nurse she had always quietly pitied, had managed to arrive at Douglas's wedding on the arm of a man who could buy the venue. Inside, the room turned, not all at once. The way a tide turns, gradually, then completely. Douglas was standing near the bar with 2 of his college friends when he saw her. Lena watched it happen. She was far enough away that she could observe without being caught observing, a skill she had developed over years of emergency rooms and difficult conversations. She watched Douglas's expression do the thing Rosamond's had done, but slower, more complicated. Because Douglas had known her face for a decade, and he was reading something in it, now that he did not have the vocabulary for. He had been expecting someone diminished. She was not diminished. Celeste saw her next. Celeste was across the room in an ivory gown that was doing its best, surrounded by bridesmaids in dusty rows, and when her eyes found Lena, they stayed there a beat too long. Lena gave her a small, courteous smile, the kind that contained nothing. No warmth, no hostility. Just the recognition that they were both in the same room, and Lena intended to behave like a person who had nothing to prove, because she did not. Theodore leaned down slightly. "Do you want a drink?" "Water," she said. "And I'd like to say hello to someone first." The someone was Philippa Hartley, a woman who had been Lena's friend before becoming one of those friends who quietly falls away during a difficult marriage and then disappears entirely during a divorce. Philippa was standing near the floral display with her husband, and when she spotted Lena, her expression shifted with a particular guilt that was almost satisfying to witness. "Lena," Philippa said, You came. I did, Lena said simply. Philippa's eyes traveled to Theodore with frank astonishment. I didn't know you were. I hadn't heard. We've been together for some time, Lena said, and left it at that. She did not perform. That was the thing she had decided on the drive over, sitting in the town car while the city lights moved past the window. She was not going to perform triumph. She was not going to make speeches or arrange her face into an expression designed for Douglas to see. She had come because she had needed to come, for reasons she was only beginning to understand, and she would move through this evening with her own gravity and return home the same person she had been when she left, only lighter somehow. Confirmed in something. Douglas found her before dinner. She had expected this. She was standing near the window with Theodore, who was speaking quietly with a man he apparently knew from some conference, and she felt Douglas's approach before she saw it. 9 years of marriage gave you that. An attunement to another person's energy that didn't disappear simply because you had signed papers. Lena. His voice was careful. She turned. He looked the same, a little older. His hair was starting to silver at the temples in a way that he had always hoped would make him look distinguished. It did, she supposed. He was wearing his wedding tuxedo, and there was champagne in his hand, and he was about to marry a woman who had helped him destroy what they had built together, and here he was, standing in front of Lena with an expression she could not quite name. Not guilt, not quite. Something adjacent to it. The look of a person who expected to feel victorious and was discovering, too late, that the victory required an audience that was not cooperating. You look, he started. Thank you for the invitation, she said. It's a beautiful venue. A pause. He glanced at Theodore, who had taken a courteous half-step away to give them space without going far. Who is he? A friend, she said. Then, because she did not owe him honesty but could afford it, more than a friend. Douglas was quiet. She recognized the quality of his silence. It was the one he used when he was recalculating, when the situation was not resolving the way he had modeled it. I didn't think you'd actually come, he finally said. I know, she said. That's why I did. She held his gaze for exactly long enough, and then she turned back toward the window and the city beyond it, and she let the conversation end. She learned the rest of it later through Philippa, who had apparently spent the ceremony and most of dinner watching Douglas rather than the event. The things Philippa told her were delivered with the particular breathlessness of a woman unburdening herself of information she had been holding too long. Douglas had intended the evening to function as a verdict. He had, it emerged, spent the better part of the past year constructing a narrative among their mutual acquaintances, in which Lena had been the cold one, the unavailable one, the woman so consumed by her career that she had hollowed out the marriage from the inside and left Douglas no choice but to seek warmth elsewhere. He had told this story at dinner parties. He had told it to Rosamund, who had retold it with enthusiastic additions. He had told it so many times that she suspected he had come to believe it himself, the way people do when a story is useful enough. The invitation, Philippa said, had been Celeste's idea as much as Douglas's. Celeste, who had spent the past 2 years occupying the life that Lena had vacated, the house, the social circle, the position, wanted to see it sealed. She wanted Douglas's first wife to witness the ceremony and absorb the message. This is over, and you lost. What neither of them had accounted for was the possibility that Lena had not spent the past 14 months being diminished. That grief, when you let it move through you instead of resisting it, sometimes deposits something solid on the other side. That Lena Whitmore at 39, standing in a midnight blue gown, next to a man who looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in any room she entered, was not a woman who had lost. She was a woman who had been relieved of a weight she had been carrying. So long she had forgotten it wasn't hers. The reception unraveled slowly, the way things do when the original premise fails. Celeste, Philippa reported, had been brittle since cocktail hour. She had watched Lena and Theodore from across the room with the expression of someone who had opened a gift expecting one thing and found another inside. By the time the toasts began, Douglas was drinking his champagne with the determined focus of a man medicating against something. Rosamund had cornered Theodore for 20 minutes during the salad course, Philippa said, and had emerged looking unsettled. Theodore apparently had been pleasant and composed and said very little that was definitive, which was somehow worse than if he had bragged. Men who had nothing to prove generally didn't. And Lena had sat at her assigned table, table 12, near the back, which told her everything she needed to know about Douglas's intentions. And she had eaten her dinner and spoken to the people around her and laughed when something was funny, and declined a second glass of wine because she was driving tomorrow morning and had a long shift ahead. She was, in short, herself, entirely, uncomplicatedly herself, and somehow that was the most devastating thing she could have been. She and Theodore left before the cake cutting. She did not make a scene. She did not catch Douglas's eye on the way out. She simply retrieved her wrap from the coat check, took Theodore's arm, and walked through the lobby of the Harrington Plaza and out through the glass doors into the October night. The town car was waiting. The driver had the door open before they reached it. Inside, Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then how do you feel? Lena thought about it. The streets moved past outside. Lit windows, late-night pedestrians. The city in its indifferent, continuous motion. Like I closed a door, she said. He nodded. He reached over and took her hand, and they rode in comfortable silence through the city. And Lena Whitmore thought about the painting in the gallery. The shipwreck, the painter's brother lost at sea, and about how knowing the grief behind something could change the shape of it entirely, make it mean something different than it first appeared. She had built a life with Douglas Whitmore for 9 years. She had given that life everything she had, and it had not been enough, and then she had grieved it completely and built something else. Something that felt, sitting in a warm car with a man who had memorized one fact about a painting just to have something to say to a stranger, something that felt more like hers. 3 months after the wedding, Douglas Whitmore's firm was audited, following an anonymous complaint to the state licensing board regarding billing irregularities. The audit was thorough. The irregularities were real. His business partner of 7 years quietly dissolved their arrangement and took several major clients in the process. By spring, Douglas had left the firm under circumstances that were described in the industry newsletter that covered such things as mutual and amicable, which everyone who reads such newsletter understands to be neither. Celeste filed for legal separation 8 months after their wedding. Philippa heard this from Rosamond, who seemed to have undergone a revision of her opinions about a number of things since October. Lena heard all of this in pieces from Philippa, who remained a reliable source not because Lena sought the information, but because Philippa seemed to need to deliver it, as though the facts transmitted to Lena could settle some debt Philippa had been carrying since the divorce. Lena listened. She did not gloat. She did not feel the particular satisfaction she might have expected to feel. What she felt was closer to the absence of something, the silence where a low-grade noise used to be, the thing you don't notice until it stops. The following April, Theodore Vance proposed on the porch of a house in coastal Maine that he had rented for the week. They had been watching the water. The sun was doing something specific and improbable with the light. He admitted afterward, been planning it for 2 months and had rehearsed several versions of what he meant to say, all of which he had abandoned because when the moment arrived, what he actually said was, "I don't want to be in a room without you in it." Lena had looked at him. The water moved. A dog barked somewhere down the beach. "That's an odd proposal," she said. "I know," he said. "Is it working?" She laughed. The same laugh as the gallery, the real one, the kind that surprised her. "Yes," she said. "It's working." They married the following September quietly. 30 people. A ceremony in the garden of a friend's home in Connecticut. Lena wore something simple and ivory, and her sister stood beside her and cried, which made Lena cry too, and Theodore stood at the end of the aisle looking at her with the expression she had finally learned to read. Gratitude. That was what it was. Not possession, not performance. Just a man who understood that he was exactly where he wanted to be, and found that fact remarkable enough to show on his face. Afterward, when the dinner had been eaten and the speeches made, and the dancing had wound down to the last few couples swaying under the string lights, Lena stood at the edge of the garden and looked up at the sky and thought about the 14 months in the Midtown apartment. The bad radiator, the second-hand piano, the Sunday calls with her sister, the slow, painstaking work of returning to herself. She had not known then what was on the other side of it. She had not needed to. She had only needed to keep going, one day at a time, trusting that the person she was reassembling would be worth knowing. She was.